Yes, so I'd like to call up our panelists Lynn, Gaspard, Elisabeth, Jaquette, Adania, Shibli, and Piero, Salabè.
Okay. It is.
Okay.
I'll go this way.
It's fine.
Oops.
Good.
There we go. And I'm so pleased to actually have all of these people gathered at the table at once. They're located in different places, far from one another. So this is the kind of thing that one doesn't get to come by every day, and it's quite special. So I'm not going to spend too much time introducing them. There's a pretty, detailed biography in the folders, and so I want to leap into the conversation. Besides, you're going to learn about them from the conversation itself, and I suppose maybe just to create a transition with the last panel, I'll begin by asking Piero a question. This is, as mentioned earlier, he is an editor for Hanser Verlag, and he specializes in translations into German. So a specialist for not exclusively fiction, but largely fiction in translation as viewed from the German language world. And we discussed this on the panel a little bit earlier today. I mean, that there are cultural differences in the editorial cultures of countries in the world, right? That Germany, as in the United States and in the UK and as in France, often have a kind of interventionist, the editors can intervene in the text that they are editing, which is to say, making sometimes global recommendations directly to the translator and to the author, as opposed to simply looking for errors of punctuation or grammar and just smoothing up the surface of it. I'm curious because you work between, you deal with several different languages and the way that they make their path into German. The difference between, for you, that kind of editorial practice between the languages themselves, is it any more difficult for you to edit a translation for Arabic? Or maybe not to make it a binary question, is it more difficult, but how is translating a novel from Arabic into editing a novel from Arabic into German different from those written in languages that you already read, such as Italian or English?
Well, there is a difference, obviously. I mean, not all editors know many languages. So most of the editors know one or two languages more than their own native language. And they are able then to compare the original to the translated manuscript, obviously. So you have there a chance to intervene, which in my case, in the Arabic, is not given. So in these cases, you are supposed to work with the translators. So if you receive the translation, you have the chance to talk with the translator in order to solve questions. There are contradictions, and so normally, in fact, when you spot something that doesn't really work, very, very probably there is either an error in the translation or there is something which is opaque in the original manuscript. If you have the chance, which is usually done, that you can be in contact with the author, you can also suggest some changes to the text. It really depends on the text that is given. If you receive a text that is not very good, you would have to make more suggestions, obviously. But then I ask myself, why am I acquiring a text that is not good? So in my logic, I would not like to intervene very much in a text I have acquired because it's good. So I would have a conversation with the translator, basically. And if there is a really legitimate suggestion to make to the author, I can do it. And I would get in touch with the author and suggest to, cut and change something. But I have not the ambition to be really better than the author or know it better than the author. And I have done this process, for instance, with an Italian manuscript, where I have worked for hours in order to cut how many pages? 2 pages.
Oh.
So what is the affect? Is the affect so important to the novel? I don't think so. In other terms, I think that you have an advantage if you edit a language you know. For instance, if someone knows Arabic, he can be closer to the author. On the other hand, if the manuscript you have acquired is good, I don't think that this is so relevant.
Gaspard, publisher of Saqi Press. This is a press with both a house that publishes in Arabic in Beirut, but also in English in London.
Though I run the English language division in the UK, I apologize for my voice. I am losing it progressively, which doesn't bode well for the book fair. Ilyas Khouri always says that he looks forward to being translated into English because that's when he's edited. I just wanted to add that because obviously we don't have that same culture of editing in the Arab world in the same way that we do in other parts of the world. So it's something that we're very familiar with and that we expect when we translate works from Arabic. Yeah, just thought I would add that.
Well, Adania, so this is a contemporary novelist who's already had a couple of books appear in English, and there will be another one on its way translated by Elisabeth Jaquette. I wonder, has your experience, for example, with Minor Detail and previous books, did you receive editorial feedback, or were these books that were largely published as you presented them to those publishers in, I suppose, Lebanon, would it be, or?
Yeah, I don't define myself as a novelist. I just write.
Yeah.
I start from that. I think my editors don't interfere too much in cutting because if they cut it, there will not be a novel. My work is so short that they really don't want to lose anything. Like sometimes they, so no, it hasn't been. Yeah, I tend to be a heavy editor myself. A work might start 150 pages. It will soon become 70 and it might become 50. And if it stayed longer with me, it will end up 1 page. But, there's a moment that I have to stop. So, yeah, I spend a lot of time. Like the last work, it has been 12 years working on it. And basically, because for me, it's a lot with what is not said, what is not written. And I work a lot on that. What is written and what should never be written. And I like this movement between the silence, the not written, the absent, and how to create this tension between the words, basically.
Well, this is a very interesting topic because it raises the question of whether or not that which is unsaid can be translated in the same way. Yeah. So, because I presume if you're dealing with suggestiveness in an Arabic book, in the original of Minor Detail, that if you're dealing in shadows, the shadows are going to be different in English than they would be in Arabic. I'm guessing, I'm intuiting that languages lead readers to expect certain things on the basis of other things that they've read in that language and what they're familiar with. And so if you're dealing with the unsaid, I would think that it's curious. It must be interesting for you to oversee the translation of a work like that.
Yeah, because, basically, like, how can a translation... There's something very beautiful that actually John Berger, I was once in a presentation where after he wrote his From A to X, from Ida to Xavier, and one of the public asked about his experience in prison. Was he in prison? And he said he was like posing, like, do I have to have this experience to be able to write? And it's like, and he was saying something very beautiful. It's about lending his voice or his body to carry a different experience. And for me, this always also about translation, how the possibility of that carrying something from one place to another without you having to have it. And sometimes even in my experience as a writer, I don't feel like I'm writing the words. I'm actually sitting in the corner waiting for them, not waiting for them. I mean, I wait for them every day, but I try not to frighten them, to let them come. I see them, and sometimes I feel like, I'm basically a pipe, and they choose, and how to deal with them. I think sometimes, and we've been discussing this in the last few days, about the living nature of language sometimes, and within that also those words that don't come, and it's a constant tension that works with this. So how you translate that which is not said, it's basically to be in that mindset as a carrier, and not as a translator. I don't know how to exactly describe this experience. Probably it demands a lot of the translator, and unfortunately they don't have so much time as these crazy writers that they can spend years, and we cannot expect this from them as well.
Well, we can pose the question, since we have the opportunity of the very translator who's dealing with this very novel, without wanting to unfold too much about a work that is very much in progress, because this translation is not complete, and I guess it will appear at some point in the late spring or summer of next year. How has your experience been of responding to the kinds of challenges that Adania is describing as a writer, into essentially rewriting them in English?
Yeah, I think it's Danny Hahn who has said something about translation that is, all I'm doing is, simply sitting down and rewriting every single word of this book. That's it. I mean, in many ways, working with a writer like Adania is a gift. To be working with someone who has such a clear intention behind, what she is doing. It makes my job as a translator much easier to be able to ask, what is your priority in this scene, or what here is most important to you, what, to be able to weigh different various choices, and to be able to choose one that will most support the vision of the writer, because at the end of the day, translation is an art, and it is an art in support of someone else's vision. But I do think, going back to what you said about an editor's interventions, and you said something similar to, it's not that my vision is better than anyone else's, but I think that is important to distance oneself from, and I really do believe in this collaborative relationship between the editor, the translator, and the author, because each has a different vision, and each has a different, if we're talking about what is written and what is silent, both the translator, the author has the audience and the readership of the original language in mind when reading it. And so in those silences, based on cultural background, language, politics, there's certain things that you can assume or guess that a reader will fill the blanks with. And that's going to be completely different for a different readership. So I do think that, in that case, those silences and those empty spaces might need to take slightly different shapes in order to lead, open the door to a reader to a different direction. You're not going to walk them through it, but if you want them to see something similar to what the source language reader would see, there might need to be a shift.
And the intention, there's a beautiful story, and I looked, and I was hoping to bring it and share. This is like Edward Said in New York in the late 60s. He hears that Jean Genet is coming to speak. The Panthers brought him. So he rushes he goes to this kind of speech moment, demonstration where Jean Genet is there. And actually it's one of his students then tells him that he will be the translator of Jean Genet from French into Arabic. Edward Said goes there, and this is very fun. So when Jean Genet would say, for instance, the blacks are the most oppressed class in the United States, the translator would go, in this motherfucking son of a bitch country in which reactionary capitalism oppresses and fucks over all the people, not just some of them, etc., etc. And Edward Said, he knows French, and he sees his student doing this translation. And in 1972, when Jean Genet, he joins the Palestinian fighters, the Fidesz in Beirut, and there's kind of meeting that is being arranged between Jean Genet and Edward Said. Of course, Edward Said is consistent. He wants to bring this kind of mistranslation, unacceptable mistranslation. And he asked Jean Genet, what was your feeling when you were being kind of mistranslated, your calm words being so much exaggerated? And he recalls what they said. And Jean Genet very calmly says, yes, true. I might not have said them, but I thought them. And this is really
the unsaid.
Yes, and exactly like, it's always also how to go within the mode of thinking of that. And even if you change the words, I mean, it's not, but it is like, some writers would hope actually that the translators, as you brought the example of Elias Khoury, that would maybe make the text is better because your inabilities with what you were not able to say. But this is where intimacy and the conversation goes beyond what can be said and what can be kept in a language. It's a very interesting discussion that how to make something even more severe that you could not do in your own language with your own rhythms, etc. Yeah.
Well, I want to take advantage of this as to transition into something based on the title of the event, the politics of translation, because I think all of you in your different ways have to confront this every day, which is how to keep, not how to get the politics in to the work, if you're dealing with a work from Palestine in the Arabic language, but rather how to mediate and restrict it, how to keep it out in some ways from what the task at hand that you have every day is. I mean, can you comment on the interference, as it were, of politics in your particular responsibilities, your particular engagements with the Arabic language?
That's a very big question. I mean, I think in the Arab world it's impossible to disengage with politics. I mean, actually, I say in the Arab world, I think in our worlds, in the West, that's the case too. But it's very real on a daily basis. But I'm not really sure if that's what you were...
Well, I mean, I think there are differences between... For example, you're the director of a literary festival. That one of the premier, or
I'm
you're
a trustee.
You're a trustee. Okay, but one of the more important. I mean,
Sure.
one of the premier literature festivals for Arabic in the Anglophone world, right? It's. I imagine that you would be confronted, or the directors, but even the trustees would be confronted with questions that would not arise at a French literature festival in the United States, in New York, for example, or that there are ways that politics have of interfering with what might otherwise be a celebration of literature and language, and that affects some of the decisions made, where you would have to somehow... I mean, there's no way out.
I now totally understand what you're saying. Yes. Quite right. There are difficulties when one wants to invite, firstly, what is Arabic literature? Is it the fact of writing in Arabic? Is it being Arab? Is it living in the Arab world? What if you are Arab but you write in English and you live in the West? What if you are a Palestinian Israeli and you write in Hebrew? Does that make you less of an Arab? If I invite a Palestinian Israeli who has previously appeared as part of the, what is it called? The guest of honor for Israel at a book fair in another country, is that problematic in itself? Can I invite a Syrian author who is pro-Assad? Can I, because these things are so contentious and it's like layer upon layer of complexities. And I mean, personally, I am a trustee of Shibli. I do not have any say, unfortunately, in the creative decision making or in the artistic program. As a publisher of Saqi books, we're confronted with this reality on a daily basis. If I publish a Saudi writer, but who is pro-regime, will I then be, will there be some reputational damage?
Yeah, we will call you a sellout.
Yeah, or if I publish, I mean, it is very, very limiting. But because it's a very real, these people, I mean, these writers, that they're on the front line. I mean, in many of these countries, it's war, it's a dictatorship. Someone was just saying that thousands have just been arrested in Egypt. The Arab world is not all about politics, and it is not all about conflict, but that is a daily life. And what was so great about your novel and such novels is that it's the personal which is of interest, and that's where I find the beauty personally, in the personal stories and so on. But we do the best that we can. At Saqi, we have a mission to promote and disseminate and champion Arabic literature, and we have done so for over 35 years. But there are some things that we cannot publish in the UK because we are afraid, not for our own safety, although we have had threats, both from the far right and Islamists, but we are afraid for our colleagues in Lebanon, because we don't know. In the past, several years ago, both my dad and the co-founder of Saqi, Mai, have appeared on Al-Qaeda websites. A few years ago, we published, it's one of our best-selling books in English. It's called The Arabic Alphabet. And we sell it for $7.99, which is a bargain. But the translators, it's an Arab and a Brit, they have included a few surahs from the Quran. And my dad got a phone call, a nasty phone call, like a death threat because of that. It's totally random. We published a book, a new edition of a book, I was just telling them this morning, of classic poetry by Arab women. So this is pre-Islamic to the Middle Ages, okay? And it's 50 Arab poets. It was first published 20 years ago, and I got several emails from different Arab men insulting me, insulting Saqi, all this stuff. And obviously in Lebanon, it's a whole other kettle of fish. But actually, this is a great example. Once we published an academic book called The Origins of the Druze. Do you remember this book? It's an academic book. It's a scholarly work about the Druze. And they're a secret religious sect. And we did not know that we are not allowed, it is not a law, but the Druze are offended. We are not allowed to publish anything about their religion or their religious, I don't know what. And so we used to print all our books in Beirut. And so when they received it from the printer, several days later, my colleagues arrived at the office to find police waiting for them. And they were going to arrest them because we published this book and it was offensive. And it's not even a law. It's not a real law. There's nothing telling us that we can't publish this book. And this is a book that we're publishing in the UK. It has nothing to do with Saqi. Anyway, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but these are some of our realities that we have to deal with.
Well, I will just divide this question into two parts because it's politics of translation. What does it mean? You mean the way we edit translation? Because also this can be a political process, or the way we choose the translations. So I would say that one of the policies of our company is to preserve language and literature from political intervention. We've heard it before, literature is very much about pleasure. So if we choose for political reasons, we are biased. How can we choose a product of art because of a political direction? I don't know. I don't think that this is a good choice. On the other hand, we have to acknowledge that there is political literature which places the subject of politics as core of its content. This is something different. This is something completely different. So in this sense, I think that any book from any place has its dignity and has to be chosen because of the inner values, inner aesthetic values that this work conveys. As Al-Aswani said before, in fact, you would be more truthful to a real political statement as an artist if you commit to the aesthetic and not looking for some political, frame. And that's the problem of many books that are offered for us. They are offered for us because apparently the author is very politically committed. Well, that's good for him. Maybe it's good for the society. But is this a good book? Is this a good novel? Does he really convey us the sense of the contradictions of a society, of the contradiction of political stances? So we know that the books we most love normally are very complex in the way they describe political processes. So in that sense, of course, there's a choice that can have this idea of choosing something politically, but not in that very superficial way. That's the one thing. The other thing is that, you know this probably, the translation tradition has somehow changed from the 60s or 70s to nowadays. For instance, we used to have translations, for instance, from Latin America, where the translator would add some sentences in order to explain things that seems to be very foreign, very exotic, or he would even change names because the names were too difficult, and so on and so on. So in my experience, and I work obviously with translators, and they would always advise me in that sense, the state of the art is to try to respect in the most possible way the spirit of the original, and not to explain too much, to leave somehow the diversity of the text to the reader. And I know that all of us, when we find in a very beautiful novel by Flaubert or Dostoevsky a Russian word or a French word we don't understand, we really appreciate that, because it makes it more curious, more interesting, and it gives us the feeling that we are reading a different text, that it's not just our own language. So these small differences to be kept, I think, is a policy of translation that is nowadays quite state of the art.
Yeah, and I would add on this. This is actually because we are not only as readers of Arabic, we are not only growing up on Arabic literature or literature that is originally written in Arabic, but translation is very major. Translated works are very major, like as Al-Aswani was mentioning. And it's major not because what it brings in terms of literature, but how it works with the language. I mean, it's beautiful to all these translations, how they also push the boundaries of Arabic language itself. And I think this is the richness sometimes of the translation, that it's not about the question of literal translation or being able to transmit it exactly as it would be said in Arabic, but how it would shift the language itself. As like, you have a guest each time would come in your house, would bring something very important to your life, and you don't try to assimilate them. And I think this is the problem of translation sometimes, that it looks at works in the sense of assimilation. Let's assimilate them, and there's something beyond that, and I think which it's a constant things of transformation and playing with language. And I wouldn't see my Arabic being formed without this literature that was translated into Arabic, because it brings freshness as a kind of a new entry to the language, basically.
Yeah. I think it's Kundera who's talked about that, is the idea of the novel as being something like a torch that is passed, and that is often passed from one country to another, from one language to another. It's the discovery by, of a French writer of Cervantes, and then Diderot does something inspired by Cervantes that will inspire a writer in England later on. That there's this almost involuntary movement from one place to the other, and that in each case, what it does is it expands the possibilities of that other language. That's what benefits from it.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. For me, the most, powerful, transformative part of translation is that it pushes the boundaries of what's possible in English, and creates new possibilities and new norms in a way that English then, has to be capacious enough to incorporate into it something that is, perhaps contrary to its instincts, but that if that language can be reshaped and reformed and then recreated in English with those qualities, I think that's an incredibly powerful act from a source language to the target language. But I want to go back to your point, Piero, about how translation has changed, and I think that Arabic translation in particular has changed over the past, perhaps even 20 years. I think that, and with many of these things, you can see the structural forces that bring translators into the world. For many other countries, especially European languages, translators have come through creative writing, comparative literature departments and are students of literature. And historically, the translators of Arabic literature tended to be Orientalists and tended to be academics, and were more interested in literature that was of interest to them academically, so that conveyed something socially or politically about a given country or a given region. And I think that we're seeing now a shift, and I guess as Alette brought up earlier, much of the translations from Arabic into English were published in university presses, whose editors, also had a different vision. It wasn't about, the beauty of the language or what was being interesting or innovative. It was more about, okay, here's some more content that we can add to our content curriculum. But I do think that there is a newer generation of Arabic translators into English, internationally speaking, who are more interested in the literature as literature. But even so, as a translator, I'm, I have the, constantly looking to two forces, both trying to be faithful to the text in the original language, and then also trying to be faithful to the presumed, often imagined English readers. And I think one great loss due to the fact that there are so few books translated, particularly from Arabic. I don't have recent stats, but if you're thinking about what was submitted for the Benepal Prize last year, which is everything published in the UK, 25, 30 books?
Is 15.
15? Okay, sorry, even lower, 15. Take your expectation, half that. But it means that each book, by being perhaps the one book from Oman translated in the past 5 years, or the one book from Yemen ever translated, it means that book for an English readership ends up kind of by default standing in, even if that wasn't the translator or author's or publisher's intention. If that's the only book that exists, or the very few books that exist or are accessible for a readership, they kind of have an outweighted presence, which I think, can't be solved at the level of language, but has to be, in terms of getting more authors into English.
Yeah. It's funny because it reminds me of the experience of a former student who translated from Thai. And when this book came out, one of the marketing strategies, I don't know how effective, but it was a fact, is like the first Thai novel ever published in the UK. And you know who I'm talking about, because there aren't that many people to confuse her with, right? And it's amazing that what's stunning to me when concerning Arabic is that as Allah had mentioned earlier, there are many speakers of Arabic. There is a long and storied literary tradition as well, and that on the other side of things, very little of that ever sees the light, even among those who want to see it, right? And perhaps it's since we have, you are an executive director of the American Literary Translators Association, but you also have judged several American prizes that focus on translation, the quality of the translation. But we also have an editor from Germany and a publisher from the UK. I'm curious if you could all comment on the vista, as it were, for Arabic literature in your respective territories.
I will say that, credit to the editors I know. I feel that they're often actively looking for Arabic works, and actively looking for things that are interesting at the level of language and not simply for a certain subject matter. I think that in Arabic we have a pipe flow problem. That might not be the right word, but, there, as we've discussed earlier today, there's essentially one agent that specializes in Arabic literature. There aren't kind of the traditional, things that an editor in the States might look for in terms of reviews or prizes that they know well, or other publishers in other countries publishing Arabic literature into their languages. So I think that there is, from the editors I'm familiar with, there is interest, but not the ability to connect with authors. It's an optimistic time for literature and translation. The number of books published in the U.S. Grew quite rapidly in 2016. It's kind of plateaued since then, which I think isn't cause for concern. I think that we're still in a moment of a lot of growth in terms of numbers of books published, and I do think that there are a lot of editors actively seeking for what they don't know.
If I may.
To be frank, I mean, here in Germany we have had lots of discussion about how can we understand the other culture, which is basically was meaning, the Islamic culture, the refugees coming, and I think millions of euros were spent for that. And before that, we all know that after the 11th of September, the interest in Islamic culture and also in Arabic culture has increased a lot. So there was an expectation of seeing that also the interest in the literature of different situation, completely different situation all over the Arabic countries would increase in terms of translations, in terms also of public feedback on that, but this hasn't really happened. If we look at the statistics, we see that it's still very difficult to publish books from Arabic countries. The reason might be that it's too different, the context is very difficult to understand, and people simply don't want to cope with this diversity, which is on one hand a bad news, on the other hand it's a challenge. And I want to go back to what Al-Aswani said. We do not have to have a perspective of a niche of even using the word Arabic. Why do we use the word Arabic? I mean, countries that are completely different. If we wouldn't say Spanish for Argentina, we wouldn't say Spanish for Mexico, as we do for Arabic. So in that sense, I think that if the passion is there when you translate and when you also as a publisher propose these works as works that are equally worth, there is no difference, there is no third world perspective. It's I am an Egyptian, I will be in this moment a citizen of Macondo. So that worked with Garcia Marquez. Any place in the world can be the center of the world when literature is universal. And that's, I think, what we have to do when we publish, when we bring these stories and these books to our readers. To have that passion that in those books, things that belong to every human being are dealt with. That's the basic thing. And I see also in the press, you have the 6, journalists who would, write the reviews on Arabic literature. It's always this niche idea, which sometimes is also something which just grew up out of necessity. On the other hand, I think it is a challenge to equalize, to think this is literature. It is not from that country or the other country, and it's very difficult because I think the numbers are always very very low. So it's still a challenge. I believe that our connection will bring forward something very positive. And I have to add one thing, that it's sort of, there are regions where things are worse. and this can be not very consolatory. But I think
Looking
you
at
were
me.
you were saying Thailand. Well, or let's think of Indonesia. Well, I think that the interest in the Arabic world and literature is stronger, also due to it's very close to Europe, and we have so strong relationships, Spain and other countries. So I'm optimistic in that sense, but there is still a lot to be done, of course.
The good news in the UK is that, because there isn't much good news, is that there's been a really important surge in students learning Arabic at university, and also then later on for MA courses, and specifically in translation courses, which are really popular at the moment. So that sort of goes hand in hand with that rise in interest, very kindly saying it's due to the proximity, not due to the terrorism. Sorry. But anyway, I think, unfortunately, in the UK, there has been no drive. There have been no drives to understand, well, not that I'm aware anyway, Arabs or Muslims or refugees. Quite the reverse, the opposite is taking place. So we are seeing quite a frightening regression. However, there are some really good news sort of items, because, which I mentioned this morning as well, over the past 15 years, there has been a 97% increase in the number of translated fiction that's being published in the UK. There are many more books, Arabic novels being published today, and also books by Arabs, which I think is important. I think this question that you raise about the term Arab versus the countries is so interesting. I actually embrace the term Arab and Arabic. I think that in the UK it's a political, going back to politics, but it's sort of stigmatized. It's as if it's a dirty word to be Arab. There was this survey that was carried out 2 years ago that showed, I can't remember the figures now, but it was something astounding, like 80% of the Brits that were surveyed. The poll was about British attitudes or their position, their thoughts on Arabs generally. 80% admitted that they knew nothing about the Arab world and about Arabs generally. So we're working in that environment, and it's difficult, but there are successes. There's, Khalid Khalifa being shortlisted in the US. There's, Celestial Bodies in the UK, and also what's his name, Mazen Marouf, he was also longlisted, and so on. And there's lots of small presses.
It's actually one of the best-selling novels of the last 2 years in translation was Frankenstein in Baghdad. So it was also a book from Egypt that also made the shortlist for the book.
Yeah. And there are important drives taking place in the Arab world. Everything that Boudour Qassimi is doing is really important. What we're seeing in Sharjah, we have to see what impact that's going to have long term, especially in terms of the professional program, but it is quite correct that Arab publishers don't come to the book fairs to Frankfurt enough, for instance. Next year, Sharjah will be, the guest of honor at the London Book Fair, so let's see what impact that has. But there's still a lot of potential there. But I think that what we need is to communicate better between publishers, and we need in the Arab world, we need more organization and more bodies to champion Arabic literature, and to really encourage and champion and support artists and creatives across all genres, actually, because they deserve it. They are working under really difficult conditions, Either you are in a war zone, or there is conflict, or there is uncertainty, or there are shortages, or you have societal pressures, you have your family, aib and haram and all this stuff, It is really difficult, and you have no support from anyone. Correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there's no publishers associate. There's no BA there is a publisher associate, but I don't know how useful
But not like
it is.
Norway is the guest of honor here at Frankfurt. What I can share for those who don't know it, Norway has an extremely generous system in whereby if you are a publisher, it's very likely that the Norwegian state or a cultural branch of the Norwegian state can help subsidize the translation of that book or help pay to send your author on tour in the United States. I'm guessing that does not happen for most of your writers.
But there's no political will to improve the situation for authors and for publishers and for retailers. Look at piracy, and we are all connected. It is one industry. If one part is broken, the whole chain is going to, break. I don't know how anyone expects us. How our governments expect us to form a strong industry when they still allow piracy. They do nothing. And so we have a situation where we are banned from selling our Muhammad Shukri books in Egypt, but then every year tens of thousands of copies are sold in Egypt. Or that's one example, but it's an excellent example. And we are losing money, or you have a situation where you have 4 editions of the same book. The Arab world is one market. You can't have one edition in Egypt and one in Lebanon. It's one market. Or maybe you can, but it would be unusual and bizarre. But, it's one market, but then you have all these different editions. Some publishers don't use ISBNs. I mean, there's a lot of potential. There's a lot of work that can be done, and I think that the writers and the publishers and the bookshops that are operating at the moment are to be commended, because they're doing really excellent work in quite, in my opinion, challenging conditions.
I would like to draw on what you're also saying about piracy and what Aswani was saying before about the inability to read, or the lack of conditions for reading. And we cannot just see it as very straightforward matter, because there's so many conditions. There are preventions. Just an example, like my books are not allowed to enter Palestine because of the Israeli authorities. So in that case, I'm writing and my books cannot be read in Palestine, and the only way to do that is piracy.
Yeah,
I know that, and I need to support that. And I think also with the cost of books. Sorry, I know you're a publisher.
There's ebooks. They can download the ebook.
Because and you see these books. For me, it's better people do this piracy and sell books that they read. I'm sorry, I know you're a publisher. It's criminal to say that.
Yes.
But in that sense,
it is criminal.
And I'm actually also with you in terms of really insisting on Arabic, because for me it's Arabic language. It is within that. I don't think I would have written in any other language. It is the joy of that language, and I think there is something within that, and I don't find the disconnectedness. It's not about nationalism, it's not about chauvinism, and I even find it more problematic to say Palestinian literature or Egyptian, because this goes in all nationalistic divisions that they are useless actually, and we see the dangers of that. But also, going back to the question of the politics of translation, of course, this is a political activity, and what you were describing, or what Piero was also saying, about the interest in Arabic literature as a response to some attack or some war. I cringe as a writer. There should be a disaster to be interested in something that is so intimate and so fragile that you work on. And I think, of course, we have this history of colonialism and Orientalism, and books have been used as a political tool. Translations have been used to understand the Arab mind, and I think there's a lot of things that should be questioned within this field. It's not like now we are working from a ground, or we're starting today. There's a whole history that is haunting and directing us in a certain way, which is problematic. And of course, we shouldn't react to it, but we should not also ignore that it's there. It's a whole very muddy, very optimistic, very pessimistic, I think, situation.
And since
let me counter that with some optimism,
yeah,
which is also a historical lens. And if you think about Latin American literature now versus in the 60s, and when Marquez was just gaining prominence in the English-speaking world, and that was one author without any reference points. And then if you look, further into the future and today, and I think that Latin American, as a prize judge and director of the translation organization, I think that some of the most exciting, new, innovative, experimental literature right now is often coming out of Latin America. And now, authors have the ability to be published in English and relate to each other in multiple subgenres that are about the writing and not about the nationality or the language. And so, it's my hope that we're looking, hopefully not at 50 years or however many years that is, but a shorter time span for that to be possible from Arabic language to English too.
Well, since there was a positive note there, that's probably a good place to stop. But could everybody please thank the panelists for all of their input?